Alright guys, so this is part 2 of chapter 9, and we're just going to continue on with where we left off in part 1. Okay, so on this particular slide, you are actually looking at the hierarchy of structure for skeletal muscle. And again, it might be a bit of a disadvantage that we're having to do this without me, physically being able to show you certain things. But I think if you pay attention to what I'm saying, we can make sense of this, okay? All right, so let me get the laser pointer. All right, so before we get into the picture, let's just kind of read through what's on the screen here so that we know a few terms. Okay, so the tendon, the epimysium, the paramysium, and the endomysium are continuous with each other. So we know what a tendon is. A tendon attaches skeletal muscle to bone. Okay, but we got 3 new terms here: epimysium, paramysium, and endomysium, that we've got to make sense of. Okay, and then there's also the statement, these sheaths also provide a muscle with blood vessels and nerves. So we need to try and understand what these 3 anatomical structures are. Okay, all right, so if we come over here, we're starting off looking at a muscle organ, a skeletal muscle organ itself. Okay. And then if we come down here, if we follow a little arrow, we can see the tendon. Now the tendon, again, we know that that's dense, regular connective tissue that is attaching the muscle organ to the bone. Okay, so surrounding each skeletal muscle organ is a sheath of connective tissue called the epimysium. Okay, kind of think of it as like the tendon sort of thins out and is continuous with a sheath of connective tissue that completely surrounds the entire muscle organ. It's going all the way around, okay? And that sheath of connective tissue that completely surrounds the muscle organ is called the epimysium. And if we were doing this in lecture, I would ask you this repeatedly over and over again. But that's really, all there is to it. So if you look at this blue square right here, what they're trying to do is indicate a cross-section through the muscle organ, and then they're projecting that up here. And so it's a skeletal muscle organ. And so again, that sheath, it's this word right here, that sheath, that covering of connective tissue that surrounds the entire muscle organ is the epimysium, which would kind of be in yellow here. You see that yellow layer? That's the epimysium. That's all there is to it. And it is continuous with the tendon. So if you pull on the tendon, will you pull on the epimysium? Yes. Okay, they are continuous with each other. Okay, so then what happens is the epimysium, think of it like this. It starts to dig in, okay? And as it starts to dig in, it goes from this yellow anatomical structure called the epimysium to this white stuff. And that white area is being referred to as the paramysium. And if you look, the paramysium, this white stuff, is surrounding these red circular structures. Okay, these red circular structures are muscle fascicles. Okay, so you've got muscle fascicles. You can see here's one fascicle that's surrounded with a black line. And so if we looked at this picture, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 muscle fascicles in this particular cross-section, okay? What are muscle fascicles? Muscle fascicles are just bundles of muscle fibers. And if you remember from the end of the part 1 video, we saw this term fibers. Muscle fibers means muscle cells. So in skeletal muscle, the way it's arranged is that the skeletal muscle fibers or cells are bundled together. A bundle is referred to as a fascicle, and then each muscle fascicle is surrounded by paramysium, which is the white stuff, okay? All right, so the epimysium is a sheath of connective tissue that surrounds the entire muscle organ. The paramysium is the sheath of connective tissue that surrounds muscle fascicles. All right. And within that paramecium area, if you look over here, there is a blood supply. So if you cut a muscle organ open, will it bleed? Yes. And then in yellow, they're trying to indicate nerves, right? So if you cut a muscle, will it hurt? Yes, it will. Okay. All right, and then they do mention this term endomysium in this particular figure, but we're not going to talk about the endomysium at this level. At this level, the level of the skeletal muscle organ, where we need to be is we need to understand that the epimysium is the sheath of connective tissue that surrounds the entire muscle organ. The epimysium then starts to dig in towards the center of the skeletal muscle and surrounds individual muscle fascicles. So each muscle fascicle is surrounded by a sheath called the paramecium. And that muscle fascicle is made up of a bunch of skeletal muscle fibers, which we know skeletal muscle fibers is just another name for skeletal muscle cells. Okay? All right, so hopefully that makes sense, but you know the deal. If this doesn't make sense, please leave questions in the comments section below this video. Okay? All right, so then we're going to come back to the skeletal muscle organ. And if we come over here, what they've done is they've pulled out one muscle fascicle, and hopefully that makes sense. Here is one fascicle. And then the same idea, you got that little blue square, which is the cross section. Follow the arrow. Okay, so now we're looking at a cross section of one muscle fascicle, which again is a bundle of fibers, and we know what fibers are. Those are skeletal muscle cells. All right. What do we call that sheath of connective tissue that surrounds a muscle fascicle? That is the paramecium. Okay. And then within this muscle fascicle, you've got your skeletal muscle fibers or cells. And so right here, they've put sort of a blue line around one skeletal muscle fiber or cell. So in this particular fascicle, there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 skeletal muscle fibers. Okay? All right, so this paramecium, the sheath of connective tissue that surrounds a muscle fascicle, it begins to move inward, sort of dig in. And so you notice the color goes from white to pink. Okay? So what's happening is this connective tissue is starting to surround individual skeletal muscle fibers. All right, that sheath of connective tissue that surrounds individual skeletal muscle fibers is called the endomysium, again, which is in pink. Okay? All right, so here's where we'd review. What do you call the sheath of connective tissue that surrounds the entire muscle organ? That's the epimysium. Sheath of connective tissue that surrounds muscle fascicles, that's the paramecium. Sheath of connective tissue that surrounds individual muscle fibers, that's the endomysium. Okay? All right, so then we come back, and within this muscle fascicle, hopefully this makes sense now, we've pulled out one skeletal muscle fiber. So that is one skeletal muscle fiber right there. That's one cell, okay, long and cylindrical, multiple nuclei. See the little blue things? Those are the nuclei. All right, so now we've got the blue square. That's the cross section. We're going to follow the arrow. Now we're looking at a cross section of one skeletal muscle fiber. And I like how they remind you in parentheses that this is one cell, okay? All right, so what do we call that sheath of connective tissue that surrounds one skeletal muscle fiber? That sheath of connective tissue is called the endomysium, okay? All right, and so if we're looking at one cell, there are some organelles here, some terms that we are a bit familiar with. For example, here's a nucleus. And remember from when we did tissues, skeletal muscle tissue, those cells have multiple nuclei. So there's a nucleus here, but there's also a nucleus over there, okay? And mitochondria, okay? So there are multiple mitochondria in this particular picture. Remember from chapter 24, the mitochondria make ATP. It takes a lot of ATP to move your skeletal muscle, okay? I think that makes sense. And so it makes sense that you would have a lot of mitochondria in these skeletal muscle fibers, because skeletal muscle needs a lot of ATP in order to contract and move the actual muscle, to move the body, okay? We've also got a sarcolemma. Remember, that was one of our new terms. That's just a plasma membrane, nothing super special. Sarcoplasm is just another name for cytoplasm. The myosatellite cell, we will talk about that in another video. That has to do with the development. It's not really relevant at this moment in time, so we're just going to set myosatellite cells aside for the time being, okay? We can see that there's a capillary, that's a blood supply, okay? So it's not surprising that there would be blood vessels present. It's necessary, right, to keep the cell alive. And then axon of a neuron. Neuron has to do with nervous tissue. We'll talk more about those terms when we get to April and we go into the nervous system. But the fact that you would have nerves down here at this level, that makes sense, okay? And then the only other term that is new to us is this term right here, myofibril, okay? And the myofibrils are actually all of those little red dots, okay? And the myofibril I'll probably start talking about in the next video, because I want to keep these videos around 15 minutes long. But a myofibril is going to be an organelle. It is an organelle that is unique to muscle tissue. So we didn't talk about it in chapter 3 when we talked about the nucleus and the rough ER and the smooth ER and the Golgi, because again, it's an organelle that is unique to muscle cells. But if you look within this muscle cell, if each red dot represents one myofibril, then it certainly looks like there's a lot of myofibrils within one skeletal muscle fiber. And there's a whole bunch of them, okay? And these myofibrils are super important for muscle contraction, which ultimately leads to movement of the body. And so the anatomical structure of these myofibrils and their physiology, how they lead to muscle contraction, we are going to start talking about in the next video and as we move further into this chapter, okay? All right, guys, thanks.